At 8:15 in the morning on August 6, 1945, a 16-year-old girl named Sunao Suboi was walking to work across a bridge in Hiroshima when the sky turned white. He survived. He lived to be 93 years old. The man who was standing next to him on that bridge did not survive. Same bridge, same moment, same blast, different outcome. The difference between those two people was not luck. It was not genetics. It was not some unknowable variable that science cannot account for. It was a specific sequence of decisions and circumstances in the minutes and hours that followed the detonation. Decisions that the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki made, either instinctively or by accident, that the people who died from radiation exposure largely did not make. We know this because Hiroshima and Nagasaki are the most thoroughly studied radiation exposure events in human history. Decades of epidemiological research, tens of thousands of documented cases, a data set so comprehensive that it forms the foundation of almost everything modern medicine knows about acute radiation syndrome, radiation dose response, and human survival thresholds under nuclear conditions. And buried in that data, in the case histories, the survivor testimonies, the medical records compiled by Japanese physicians under impossible conditions in the days after the blast, is a survival manual that almost nobody has read. Today, we read it. Because here is the thing about nuclear events that the culture of fear surrounding them has buried under 70 years of cinematic apocalypse imagery. The majority of people within the survivable zone of a nuclear detonation die not from the blast itself, not from the heat, not from the initial radiation pulse. They die from what they do and don't do in the hours that follow. They die from decisions, and decisions can be studied, learned, and changed. Let's start with the numbers that nobody talks about. The survivable zone nobody tells you about. The standard cultural narrative about nuclear weapons is binary. There's the people who die instantly, and there's everyone else who eventually dies from radiation. That narrative is wrong, and it's wrong in a way that gets people killed, because people who believe survival is impossible don't try to survive. At Hiroshima, the bomb detonated approximately 600 meters above the city with a yield of approximately 15 kilotons. The immediate blast and heat killed everyone within roughly 500 meters of the hypocenter, the point on the ground directly below the detonation. That is not a survivable zone, and nothing in this video changes that. Between 500 meters and approximately 2 kilometers from the hypocenter, outcomes were mixed. Exposure was severe. Many people died. Many people survived. The variables that determined which outcome occurred are what this video is about. Beyond 2 kilometers, the majority of people who were not killed by immediate blast effects, flying debris, or fire survived, including many people who received significant radiation doses. The Atomic Bomb Survivor Study, conducted by the Radiation Effects Research Foundation over decades, tracked more than 100,000 survivors who were within 10 kilometers of the hypocenter. The data is unambiguous. Survival was not only possible at significant distances, it was common. And among those who received similar radiation doses, behavioral factors in the immediate aftermath produced measurable differences in outcome. This is the information the survival community should be teaching, and almost entirely isn't. Now let's talk about what those behavioral factors actually were. The first 5 minutes, the flash, the blast, and what you do with your body. The sequence of a nuclear detonation at distance is not simultaneous. It is ordered. And understanding the order is the difference between being a passive victim of physics and being someone who uses the order to survive. The first thing that arrives is light, the thermal pulse, a burst of electromagnetic radiation, including visible light, ultraviolet, and infrared, travels at the speed of light. It arrives before any sound, before any pressure wave, before any physical force. In the open, at survivable distances, this pulse causes flash burns on exposed skin, severe, deep burns that arrive in a fraction of a second and require no contact, no fire, no heated surface. The Hiroshima survivors who were shielded from the thermal pulse, who were behind a wall, inside a building, around a corner from the direct line of sight to the detonation, had dramatically better survival outcomes than those who were in the open, even at the same distance. The thermal pulse travels in straight lines. It cannot bend around corners. Anything that breaks the line of sight between you and the fireball absorbs the thermal energy instead of your skin. This creates the first survival principle, which sounds almost absurdly simple. If you see the flash, get behind something solid immediately. Don't run, don't look at it. Drop and get behind the nearest solid object, a concrete wall, a vehicle, a brick structure, the earth itself if you're in open terrain. Get low and get behind something, and protect your exposed skin from the direct line of sight. You will have time to do this. The thermal pulse and the blast wave are separated by seconds, the same physics that separates lightning from thunder. At 2 kilometers from a detonation, you have approximately 6 seconds between the flash and the arrival of the blast wave. At 5 kilometers, you have approximately 15 seconds. These are not long windows, but they are real windows, and the survivors who used them, who got behind walls and dropped to the ground in the seconds between the flash and the blast, had significantly better outcomes than those who stood and stared. The blast wave arrives second. It is a wall of overpressure moving outward from the detonation point, followed immediately by a suction wave as the pressure equalizes. It destroys buildings. It throws people. It turns debris into projectiles. At survivable distances, the primary killers associated with the blast wave are not the pressure itself, but the secondary projectiles it creates: glass, wood, metal, traveling at speeds sufficient to penetrate the body. The Hiroshima data shows that a significant percentage of blast zone survivors were injured by flying glass. Not by radiation, not by heat, by the windows of the buildings they were standing near being blown inward at high velocity. The survivors who had gotten flat on the ground behind solid objects before the blast wave arrived presented with dramatically lower rates of penetrating fragment injury than those who were standing or moving. Get flat. Get behind solid mass. Face away from the detonation point. Cover your neck and the back of your head. The carotid arteries and the brainstem are your most critical and most exposed vascular structures. The fireball and the mushroom cloud form after the blast wave. By the time you see the cloud forming, the immediate physical forces have already passed your location. Now the survival problem changes completely. Now you are in a race against something invisible. The first 15 minutes. The fallout clock starts now. Here is where most people's mental model of nuclear survival collapses, because most people believe radiation arrives with the blast, that it's part of the initial event, already done to you by the time the cloud rises. That belief kills people who had no reason to die. The initial radiation pulse, gamma rays and neutrons emitted directly from the detonation, does travel at or near the speed of light and arrives with the flash. At distances beyond approximately 1 kilometer from a 15-kiloton detonation, this initial pulse is survivable, and its effects are already complete within the first second. You cannot do anything about initial pulse radiation after the fact. Whatever dose you received from it, you received it. But the initial pulse is not the primary radiation threat for people in the survivable zone. The primary threat is fallout. Fallout is the radioactive material, fission products, activated soil and debris, weapon components, that was vaporized and carried upward into the mushroom cloud and is now descending back to Earth. It is particulate matter. It falls like a fine, invisible, lethal dust, and it does not arrive instantly. It takes time to ascend and descend. Depending on wind, altitude, and yield, significant fallout deposition at ground level can begin anywhere from 15 minutes to several hours after detonation. This gap, between the detonation and the arrival of fallout, is the most important survival window in the entire event. It is the window the Hiroshima survivors who lived the longest instinctively used, and it is the window that most people in a modern nuclear event would waste standing in the open staring at the cloud. The rule that radiation specialists call the 7 to 10 rule tells you everything you need to know about why this window matters. For every 7-fold increase in time after detonation, radiation intensity decreases by a factor of 10. 1 hour after detonation, radiation levels are roughly 90% lower than they were at 7 minutes. 7 hours after detonation, they are roughly 90% lower than they were at 1 hour. The fallout is most intensely radioactive in the first hour. Getting shielded mass between you and fallout in the first 15 minutes, before significant deposition has occurred at your location, is worth more than any other single action you can take. The Hiroshima survivors who moved, who walked, crawled, or were carried away from the hypocenter area and into substantial structures in the first hour, had measurably better long-term survival outcomes than those who remained in the open or in damaged, unshielded structures. Some of them didn't understand why they were moving. Some of them were moving because their instincts told them to get away from the source of whatever had just happened. But the physics rewarded the movement regardless of the reasoning behind it. Direction matters. The fallout cloud moves with the wind. The Hiroshima bomb detonated in relatively calm conditions with low wind speed, which is part of why fallout patterns were relatively concentrated. In a modern event with any significant wind, fallout deposition will be heaviest downwind of the detonation point. Moving perpendicular to the wind direction, crosswind, takes you out of the primary fallout corridor faster than moving directly away from the detonation point. You need to know wind direction. Right now, in your daily life, knowing which direction the wind is blowing should become a habit. In the immediate aftermath of a nuclear event, it is operationally critical information. Shielding, the physics of what stops radiation. The fallout you are trying to shield against is primarily emitting gamma radiation, high-energy photons that penetrate most materials. The shielding question is not whether a material blocks radiation completely, nothing does completely, but how much mass it puts between you and the source. Mass is what stops gamma radiation. Dense mass stops it faster. The measure used is halving thickness, the depth of a given material required to reduce radiation intensity by 50%. Concrete halves gamma radiation intensity at approximately 6 centimeters of thickness, steel at approximately 2.5 centimeters, earth at approximately 9 centimeters, wood at approximately 30 centimeters. Each additional halving thickness reduces intensity by another 50%. The mathematics compound quickly. 6 halving thicknesses of concrete, 36 centimeters, a typical interior concrete wall, reduces gamma intensity to approximately 1.5% of its unshielded value. The Hiroshima survivors who sheltered in reinforced concrete buildings, particularly those who sheltered in interior rooms below grade or surrounded by multiple walls, received dramatically lower radiation doses than those who sheltered in wood-frame structures or remained in the open. The Hiroshima Industrial Promotion Hall, the building now preserved as the atomic bomb dome, was close enough to the hypocenter that the blast passed largely downward rather than laterally through it, leaving the shell standing. People in the basement survived. Basements are the single best available shelter in most residential environments. Underground is better. The earth itself is one of the most effective radiation shields available. A basement with earthen walls, a root cellar, an underground structure, a subway tunnel, reduces fallout gamma exposure to a fraction of what it would be on the surface. If no basement is available, the interior of a large concrete or brick building on the middle floors provides meaningful shielding. You want mass on all sides, floor above, floor below, walls on all sides. The roof is a critical concern because fallout deposits on horizontal surfaces. Being directly under a roof that has accumulated fallout deposition puts you in close proximity to a radiation source. Middle floors, away from exterior walls and away from the roof, maximize the shielding mass between you and both deposited fallout above and ground-level contamination below. The Hiroshima survivors who understood none of this, but who happened to be in the right physical positions, underground, in interior rooms of concrete structures, in natural terrain depressions with earth above them, survived doses that killed people in the open nearby. You don't need to understand the physics to benefit from it, but understanding it means you make the right choices deliberately rather than by accident. Decontamination, the step that saved people who didn't know it was saving them. Here is one of the most important and least discussed findings in the Hiroshima survivor data. People who washed survived at higher rates than people who didn't. Not because washing removes radiation from your body, it doesn't once absorbed, but because fallout is particulate. It lands on your skin and clothing as physical particles. Those particles continue to irradiate the tissue they're in contact with for as long as they remain in contact with it. The dose you receive from external contamination is a function of both the intensity of the particles and the duration of contact. Removing the particles removes the ongoing dose. Some Hiroshima survivors, by instinct or by proximity to water, washed themselves in the immediate aftermath of the blast. Some Hiroshima survivors, by instinct or by proximity to water, washed themselves in the immediate aftermath of the blast. The Ota River runs through Hiroshima. Many survivors waded into it, some to cool burns, some simply because it was there. The ones who washed within the first hour of the event and who removed and abandoned their outer clothing received meaningfully lower total radiation doses from external contamination than those who did not. The practical protocol? As soon as you are in a sheltered position, remove your outer clothing. Everything that was exposed to open air during fallout deposition should come off. Outer layers can carry 80 to 90% of external contamination. Remove them carefully. Don't shake them, don't brush them against your face, and leave them outside your shelter or in a sealed bag. Wash exposed skin, face, neck, hands with water and soap if available. Blow your nose and wipe around your eyes and ears with a damp cloth. You are mechanically removing particles. If no water is available, wiping exposed skin with a damp cloth or even a dry cloth is better than nothing. You are reducing contact time between radioactive particles and your body. Do not use conditioner on your hair in this scenario. It binds particles to hair strands. Shampoo and rinse. Rinse thoroughly. Cover your mouth and nose if you have not already. Inhaled and ingested fallout particles deliver internal doses, radiation from inside the body, where there is no shielding at all. A damp cloth over the mouth and nose, a purpose-built N95 respirator, anything that reduces particle inhalation during movement through contaminated air reduces internal dose. This was not available to most Hiroshima survivors, who were in the open before the concept of fallout deposition was understood. It is available to you. The water question: what Hiroshima survivors drank and why it mattered. The Ota River became a desperate water source in the hours after the Hiroshima detonation. Thousands of survivors drank from it, waded into it, died in it. The water question in a nuclear event is one of the most practically important and most misunderstood survival variables. Here is the critical distinction. Water underground before the detonation is not contaminated by the detonation. Groundwater, well water, water from underground pipes that remained intact, received no direct fallout exposure and is safe to drink. Surface water, rivers, lakes, ponds, collected rainwater, can receive fallout deposition and becomes contaminated. The Hiroshima survivors who had access to covered wells or intact underground water infrastructure in the immediate aftermath were drinking uncontaminated water. Those drinking from the Ota River were drinking water with fallout deposition. This distinction, underground water versus surface water, is the primary water safety rule for the first 72 hours after a nuclear event. Sealed containers, cans, bottles with lids, covered cisterns that were inside or underground during fallout deposition contain water uncontaminated by the event. The container shielded the contents. Open containers, water collected after the event, water from surface sources in the fallout zone, treat as contaminated. Stored water in your survival preparations should be in sealed containers kept inside or underground. This is not complex. It is the difference between a functioning immune system and one that is trying to process radiation damage while simultaneously fighting waterborne pathogens. Iodine is the other water variable that the Hiroshima data informs indirectly and that subsequent research has confirmed directly. Radioactive iodine, iodine 131, is a fission product released by nuclear detonations. It is absorbed by the thyroid gland, where it irradiates thyroid tissue and dramatically increases thyroid cancer risk. Potassium iodide tablets, taken before or immediately after exposure, saturate the thyroid with stable iodine, blocking uptake of radioactive iodine. Potassium iodide does not protect against all radiation. It protects specifically against thyroid uptake of radioactive iodine. But thyroid cancer was one of the most significant long-term health consequences of nuclear event exposure in populations studied after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Chernobyl. A single dose of potassium iodide at the right moment is one of the most cost-effective preparedness investments available. It costs almost nothing. It does exactly one thing. And that one thing matters enormously in the specific scenario for which it's designed. The psychological survival factor. What the data shows about who kept moving. There is a variable in the Hiroshima survival data that doesn't appear in radiation physics textbooks, but that appears consistently in survivor testimonies and that subsequent research in disaster psychology has confirmed repeatedly. The survivors who kept moving fared better than those who stopped. Not always, not in every case, but as a pattern across the dataset, the people who maintained purposeful movement in the first hour, who made decisions and acted on them, who helped others and, in doing so, maintained their own momentum, who walked toward shelter rather than sitting in shock, had better survival outcomes than those who went into psychological shutdown. This is not a trivial finding. Acute stress response in the aftermath of a catastrophic event produces a spectrum of reactions. At one end, hyperactive flight response, running blindly, which in a fallout scenario can mean running into higher contamination zones. At the other end, psychological freeze, sitting motionless in the open, unable to process or act. Neither extreme serves survival. But purposeful, directed movement, even imperfect movement in approximately the right direction, outperforms paralysis every time. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, a physician who was himself severely injured in the Hiroshima blast and who kept a detailed diary of the immediate aftermath, documented this pattern in his own experience and in the patients he eventually treated. The people who kept helping, kept moving, kept making decisions, however painful and however imperfect those decisions were, stayed alive longer and recovered better than those who surrendered to the scale of what had happened. The psychological preparation for a nuclear event is therefore not about eliminating fear. Fear in this scenario is appropriate and will be present regardless of preparation. The preparation is about having a pre-committed action sequence that your mind can execute under fear, so that when your cognitive load is maxed out by the scale of the event, you don't have to decide what to do. You already decided. You just execute. Get flat and behind cover at the flash. Move crosswind and away from the detonation point in the window between flash and fallout. Get into the most massive shielded structure available before fallout deposition begins. Remove outer clothing and wash exposed skin. Protect your airway. Use only sealed or underground water. Take potassium iodide if available. Stay sheltered for a minimum of 24 hours, ideally 48. The 7 to 10 rule means radiation levels are dropping dramatically with time, and every hour you stay sheltered is an hour at lower exposure. That sequence. That is what the Hiroshima survivors who lived the longest did, in fragments, by instinct, by accident, by help from others who were doing the same things. That sequence is not complicated. It requires no equipment that can't be obtained for under $20. It requires only that you know it exists and have decided in advance to execute it. The number that changes everything. Let's end with the number that reframes this entire discussion, 200,000. That is the commonly cited death toll for Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, the number that appears in textbooks, in documentaries, in every cultural reference to the bombs. Here is the number that almost never appears alongside it. Approximately 200,000 people were also within the affected zones of both cities and survived. Not survived with no effects, not survived without suffering, survived. Lived past the acute exposure window, lived past the first year. Many of them lived long lives. The atomic bomb survivor study cohort, the people tracked for decades by the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, is composed of people who were close enough to both detonations to receive significant radiation exposure and who nonetheless lived long enough to be studied. The cohort ran to over 100,000 people. Sunao Tsuboi, who was on that bridge in Hiroshima at 8:15 in the morning on August 6, 1945, attended the 70th anniversary commemoration of the bombing in 2015. He was 90 years old. He had been 1.2 kilometers from the hypocenter. Nuclear events are survivable, not comfortable, not without consequence, but survivable for a much larger percentage of the people in the affected zone than the cultural narrative around nuclear weapons has ever acknowledged. The difference between the people who survived and the people who didn't is written in the data. The data is available. The lessons are learnable. The sequence is executable by anyone with 20 minutes of advanced preparation and the decision to take the threat seriously before it arrives. The flash comes before the sound. You have seconds. Know what to do with them.